What's up, everybody? John the Morgile here. Gonna do another video for you guys. Hope you enjoy. Want to give a big shout out and thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to support this channel and become a patron, you can do so for as little as $1 per month at www.patreon.com/themorgile. Or if you'd like to support with a one-time contribution to the channel effort, you can do so to www.paypal.me/themorgile. So we are expected to believe that the spherical world and the elusive theory of gravity host thousands of satellites as a key to worldwide communications and navigational infrastructure. Now, I must differentiate between the fact that what goes up must come down is certainly a thing here in reality. However, the mechanics of that have nothing to do with the space-time or Einstein's theory of gravity. We're led to believe that satellites are necessary to support the wireless connectivity and GPS that we use on a daily basis. Now, subconsciously, we're forced to thank NASA for the satellites in outer space which enable the modern internet, when there's probably no such thing as satellites in reality. So-called space agencies the world over pretend to launch satellites into orbit, demanding more and more forced funding out of our tax dollars to continue the charade that is space. Countless billions are thrown at such agencies, who in turn produce a convincing show designed to trick the population into believing that rocket launches are a critical function supporting modern communications, which is wholly reliant upon satellites in outer space. But what if satellites are just a big scam? The satellite begins its story with science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke in 1945, when the orbiting gadgets were first proposed theoretically in Wireless World magazine. People were led to believe that the curvature of the Earth prevented radio frequency waves from propagating indefinitely. Thus, satellites were necessary to shower all corners of the Earth in radio frequency connectivity. Now, it's worth mentioning the theoretical inception of satellites would be a couple short years after the death of Nikola Tesla and the illegal seizure of his intellectual property by the US government after his death. So, under the assumption that our current communications infrastructure is indeed supported strictly by terrestrial tower and wire fiber optic systems, utilizing the intellectual property of Tesla for wireless hubs, as opposed to being reliant upon satellites whatsoever, it makes a lot of sense to see a sensational cover story which the powers that ought not be would use to completely misdirect people's attention from reality, simultaneously furthering the globe Earth space age narrative. Satellites are the perfect vehicle to manufacture consent for dumping billions of dollars annually towards a government/military outfit, which was created by literal Nazis who were spirited away from Germany via Operation Paperclip after World War II. While covertly placing Nazis in positions of scientific influence in the post-war US seems a bit fishy to the modern observer. However, I can assure you that the men who fought in World War II would not be thrilled at all to learn about this fact. This is why power grab operations like Paperclip were done covertly. During the decades that followed the inception of NASA, the unsuspecting masses were led to believe that the only way to have quote-unquote global communications was to take advantage of the Earth's assumed sphericity and launch satellites to create a spherical communications grid around the planet, thus warranting a blank check to the government, covering, well, pretty much any price tag one can imagine. What we got in return was nothing more than a facade and propaganda. This propaganda would ultimately culminate in the space program and subsequent moon landing hoaxes, where the US and Russia appear to have been silent partners in the Orwellian space race and Sputnik scare. This all came on the heels of decades of space-aged propaganda in the form of science fiction films and shows and books. people were convinced that satellites were a necessary part of the future, and so funding for NASA came pretty easily on the heels of that long-term propaganda campaign. But of course, the actual infrastructure was built with a massive physical network of towers and cables and now fiber optics, which run across every part of the land, across every ocean, to every continent, even to this day, in spite of the fact that we supposedly have thousands of satellites up there to connect the world. The dominating feature of nearly any modern landscape is certainly the towers, which testify to the use of terrestrial technology in order to facilitate modern wireless communications, and they have nothing to do whatsoever with satellites. Anyone who's lost a cell signal in the woods, or during any horror movie ever written, can testify to the fact that our cellular phones rely upon nearby towers, and certainly not a hypothetical satellite hundreds or even thousands of miles away up in the sky. So the hypothetical satellites of sci-fi writer Arthur C. Clarke back in 1945 became the official propaganda line shortly thereafter. Over 70 years later, and we're still using upgraded versions of tower and wire systems under the guise of satellite-based systems, thus legitimizing the outrageous fees for service which utilize critical infrastructure that was indeed paid for by our very own tax dollars in the first place. Of course, due to the outrageous supposed cost of launching and maintaining communication satellites, the expense is psychologically justified, at least hypothetically. You can see in this video here from the early 1950s, it clearly shows what appeared to be a cell phone tower as well as a parabolic dish, satellite dish, years before any satellites were even claimed to be in orbit. Of course, there were already radar dishes prior to this time frame, but the setup shown here in the early to mid 1950s looks very similar to modern cellular and satellite technology, supporting the hunch that the world governments have been using terrestrial technologies as opposed to satellite technologies for communications and geological positioning all along. Now, it's no secret that radio triangulation was around long before satellites were even theorized, and the same can be said about the LORAN navigational systems which were used by mariners since the 1940s. Now, this isn't to say that very many people are in on the global hoax. In order for NASA to successfully fake the moon landings, for example, a very small number of people in high places would necessarily know that traveling to the moon was absolutely impossible, or at least too damn costly to justify actually trying, and thus a hoax could be formulated without anyone actually knowing about the Earth being flat. In other words, whomever is ultimately responsible for faking space may not have necessarily known that the Earth wasn't a ball. Perhaps they were led to believe that the mission to the moon was an actual goal for NASA in the beginning, but at some point it became clear that it was an impossible goal, or at least implausible. Now, this goes for the astro liars too, even to this day. Just because they're faking space doesn't necessarily mean that they know the Earth is flat. Perhaps they do know, but giving everyone the benefit of the doubt, it isn't necessary for them to know the Earth isn't a globe in order to fake space missions and such. Now, as for the big communications companies, odds are they're probably not in on the hoax either. Giant cell towers all over the place are a testament to the absolute critical need for radio frequency towers to support modern cellular and GPS technology without having anything to do with satellites whatsoever. And that brings us to the rollout of the 5G wireless hubs. The next generation of Wi-Fi or wireless internet will be completely different than what we're used to today. Instead of these enormous cell towers every few miles, we'll have microwave-sized hubs on existing telephone poles and flag posts all over the damn place, every couple 100 foot or so. Now, this is owing to the fact that the new 5G wireless technology relies upon ultra-high frequency millimeter wavelength signals of up to 58.8 gigahertz. Now, such high frequencies don't travel as far, nor do they penetrate solid obstructions as well as the frequencies and wavelengths used today in 4G technology. So 5G will be actualized by placing many smaller hardware components all over the damn place. This brings up some grave questions about the health effects of 5G technology, which at this moment are largely unknown, but appear to be possibly detrimental to the health of those exposed to the micro and millimeter wavelength radio frequency waves. Areas which have rolled out 5G technology in their communities, we'll just call them guinea pigs, have seen a spike in specific health problems which appear to be related to 5G RF waves. But of course, the governmental consumer protection agencies that are supposed to be, protecting people from runaway corporations are, well, they're in bed with the communications giants. So not only will 5G be fast-tracked, but the federal government will actually help these communications companies to circumvent local and state legislature designed to protect people from these runaway corporations. So not only are the consumer protection agencies like the FTCC not doing their job, but they're actually doing the opposite of their job, right? And that's of course because the big companies and the government are, well, they're synonymous. It's like the same people are responsible for protecting us from the big corporations. Those same people work for the big corporations they're supposed to be protecting us from. So, you could say that it's a conflict of interest, but that would make too much damn sense, right? So the 5G technologies will be fast-tracked into local and state legislature and fast-tracked into implementation, side effects be damned, in the coming years. Now, many studies have associated the lower level RFR exposure with a litany of health effects, including DNA single and double strand breaks, which leads to cancer, oxidative damage, which leads to tissue deterioration and premature aging, disruption of cell metabolism, increased blood-brain barrier permeability, melatonin reduction leading to insomnia and increasing cancer risks, disruption of brain glucose metabolism, generation of stress proteins leading to a myriad of diseases, and the list continues on. And that's just what people have figured out about the 4G stuff. The new 5G technology utilizes higher frequency mmW bands, which give off the same dose of radiation as airport scanners. The effects of this radiation on public health have yet to undergo the rigors of long-term testing, but of course the federal government and big communications companies don't give a damn about any of that. Adoption of 5G will mean more signals carrying more energy through the high frequency spectrum, with more transmitters located closer to people's homes and workplaces, basically a lot more and a lot more potent RF radio frequency waves flying around us. Perhaps the strongest concern involves adverse effects of millimeter wavelengths on human skin. Dr. Yael Stein of Jerusalem's Hebrew University states over 90% of microwave radiation is absorbed by the epidermis and dermis layers, so human skin basically acts as an absorbing sponge for microwave radiation. Now, disquieting as this may sound, it's generally considered acceptable so long as the violating wavelengths are greater than the skin layer's dimensions. But millimeter wavelengths violate this condition. Furthermore, the sweat ducts in the skin's upper layer act like helical antennas, which are specialized antennas constructed specifically to respond to electromagnetic fields. With millions of sweat ducts and 5G's increased RFR needs, it stands to reason that our bodies will become far more conductive to this radiation. which is a bad thing. The full ramifications of this fact are presently unclear, especially for more vulnerable members of the public, such as babies, pregnant women, the elderly, and such, but what can you do about that? It's not like we can get in the way of progress, even if it means everybody's, prone to get extremely ill from this technology. Now, the big question that I have is if the internet, Wi-Fi, and GPS are reliant upon more and more, better and better satellites in outer space, then why are the big communications companies wanting to roll out millions and millions of little 5G boxes every couple hundred feet all over the damn place, in spite of some very serious health concerns? What is the purpose of the multi-billion-dollar satellite program if we end up placing physical hardware all over the place? Why are we running fiber optic cables across oceans if satellite technology is supposed to take care of that? Some of the biggest problems with the idea of satellites themselves lie in the logistics of their orbit. Alliance claims that, quote, when a satellite reaches exactly 42,164 kilometers from the center of the Earth, or about 36,000 kilometers from the Earth's surface, it enters a sort of sweet spot in which its orbit matches the Earth's rotation. Because the satellite orbits at the same speed that the Earth is supposedly turning, the satellite seems to stay in place over a single longitude, though it may drift north to south. This special high Earth orbit is called geosynchronous, end quote. In other words, once a satellite reaches about 22,000 miles in altitude and has a velocity of about 2 miles per second, it magically becomes geosynchronous. Now, this might sound honky-dory at first, but upon closer examination, it's clearly an impossibility for such a thing to occur. Let's consider this claim a moment. In order for a satellite to maintain an orbit that remains fixed above the same spot on the ball Earth at all times, it's claimed that a specific speed and altitude must be reached. To assume that an inanimate object, which only has the ability to make minor course corrections at best, can maintain an orbit which somehow remains geosynchronous is categorically absurd. You see, the Earth is allegedly in motion, which means certain portions of any orbit would be racing against the Earth's orbital velocity, while other portions of the satellite's orbit would necessarily be contrary to that of the Earth's velocity. You see, it's claimed that the way a geostationary satellite works is that it reaches a certain specific speed and altitude, which allows for it to remain over a single point relative to the face of the Earth at all times. This is by definition categorically impossible. In order to orbit the Earth as described, the satellite would necessarily accelerate and decelerate depending on where it is in relation to the Earth's motion. So its position relative to the orbital velocity of the Earth. Sometimes the satellite would be traveling in a similar direction as the Earth's orbit, and other times they would be traveling in opposite directions. The satellite would need to accelerate greatly when racing against the Earth, and would need to decelerate or even retrograde when the Earth is traveling contrary to the satellite's trajectory, in order to keep the satellite above a certain point of the Earth's surface at all times. Now, by definition, nature demands that such an object be traveling at a varying speed, accelerating at times when necessary, and decelerating at other times, even retrograding when necessary, to ensure that the satellite remains overhead a specific point on the face of the Earth at all times. So how in the world can Alliance claim that a specific speed and altitude must be reached to ensure geostationary orbit, when such an orbit would only be possible if the satellite was wildly varying in velocity through space? The same problem, amongst others, also applies to the Moon. If we consider the globe-Earth theory, the Moon is a perplexing object indeed. Of course, we only ever see one face of the Moon at all times, which is highly unlikely due to chance, and is therefore a major problem for the chaotic globe Earth theory. The mechanisms involved with the moon's alleged orbit are far from chaotic or random, but appear to be more like a fine-tuned watch to produce the apparent results we see in reality. We see the moon phase through its cycle every 28 days or so, like clockwork, and we only ever see one face of the moon at all times. Now, it's claimed that this is owing to the moon's orbit, which takes 28 days to complete, and the moon's rotation upon its axis once every 28 days as well. The perfection of this cycle is immaculate and simply could not be chalked up to a lucky coincidence. So the theory of tidal locking was invented to apologize for this bizarre, highly unlikely fact of nature. Now, it's claimed that the tides of the Earth somehow favor one side of the moon, which is supposedly nearly perfectly spherical in shape, so how gravity can attract one side of the moon favoring that side more so than the other is lost on me. I mean, really, how could the Earth's tide, or gravity, favor one side of the spherical moon forever over the other side of the moon, which is, again, supposedly a perfect sphere? But handing them tidal locking just for argument's sake, it still doesn't solve the problem uncovered with just a bit of critical, skeptical examination. The only possible way that the moon, or any alleged satellite for that matter, can maintain an orbit and rotation wherein we only see one face of the object forever would be if that object has the ability to accelerate when necessary and decelerate when necessary, and synchronize its rotation with such fluctuations in velocity to ensure that a completely unrelated body only sees one face of said object at all times. There is absolutely no sweet spot or velocity which will magically override the physical laws which must apply to the globe theory. The only possible way for a satellite to achieve such a geostationary orbit would be if the satellite has a widely variable speed through space and a variable rotational velocity synchronized with such fluctuations in speed. Considering geostationary satellites, they too would necessarily vary in speed in order to keep their relative position consistent over a point on the face of the Earth. If the Earth were allegedly stationary, sure, this would not be a problem for a satellite traveling at a constant speed. But the Earth isn't alleged to be stationary, not at all. When you consider the Earth's alleged non-existing motion, the idea of a geostationary satellite traveling at a consistent speed is just absolutely laughable and could not occur in reality. By definition, the satellites would need to vary in speed wildly, depending on their position relative to the Earth's trajectory. But we're expected to believe that a satellite hits this sweet spot of distance from the Earth and velocity, and can just be in geosynchronous orbit indefinitely, perpetually, with some very minor course corrections over the years to ensure that its orbit remains true. Again, the only way such a thing would be possible in terms of geostationary orbit would be if the Earth were stationary and the satellite were orbiting at a consistent speed. This would allow for a satellite to orbit at a consistent speed and altitude and remain overhead the same point on Earth at all times. Now, when you add the alleged motion of the Earth into the mix, then satellites must necessarily accelerate to astonishing velocities at times and decelerate to a crawl or even retrograde at other times in order to remain overhead of a single point on the hypothetical spinning ball Earth in orbit around the Sun at over 66,000 miles an hour. In terms of the Moon's alleged orbit, it must make its orbit in about 28 days and rotate once upon its axis in the same amount of time, ensuring that one face of the Moon is ever pointed down towards the face of the Earth. Now, by the same fundamental laws of physics affecting the man-made satellite, the Moon could not be orbiting at a consistent speed through space in order to make one cycle in 28 days, and also ensuring that each half of its orbit takes about 14 days, like clockwork, as made apparent by the phases of the moon. It's claimed that the moon is rotating upon its axis at a constant speed, in lockstep with its orbital velocity, to ensure that observers on Earth only ever see one face of the moon. But again, even if its orbital trajectory were possible by maintaining a constant speed, which is not possible, but even if it were, then its rotational speed would necessarily vary as well, depending on the time of month, in order to ensure that we only ever see one face of it. So, in order to believe in the ball Earth theory, we must admit that the moon would necessarily speed up in space at times and slow down in space at other times to ensure that it completes each half of its orbit in 14 days like clockwork. And it would need to adjust its axial rotation accordingly to assure that we only ever see one face of the moon perpetually. To state that the moon travels at a consistent speed, assuming the globe Earth theory, is a sheer impossibility. The moon would need to travel at a widely varying speed in order to assure that the moon passes through the no moon phase at the same rate that it passes through the full moon phase. During the full moon phase, the moon should be experiencing a much longer path of travel through space compared to the no moon orbital position, and should therefore be traveling much faster during the full moon phase. This would be necessary to achieve observable reality, yet science claims that the moon is traveling at a consistent speed. You see, there is no intelligence controlling the moon's velocity, so it would be altogether impossible to say that the moon is varying its speed intelligently in order to produce observable reality. So the physical laws governing bodies in motion are thus ignored to favor the ball Earth theory, and it is thus claimed that the moon travels at a consistent speed, because it wouldn't make any sense to say that the moon is varying its speed intelligently to assure that we get observable reality as a result. In truth, the globe Earth theory is absolutely ridiculous. The utter lack of curvature and motion of the Earth are really quite enough to end the discussion altogether, yet many people are simply incapable of seeing reality, which is a shame. Where a static plane indeed lies in reality, the majority of people see a spinning sphere in their imagination. When you start to question things like satellites, they're shown to be, well, complete fiction, yet are imprinted in our minds by propaganda as a staple of modern life. This makes it extremely difficult for people to realize they might have been tricked about satellites altogether, but it does raise some difficult questions, like who's responsible for this deception, and why would they lie about such a thing? While I don't pretend to have answers to such questions, it's clear that somewhere along the line in history, or person story, it's clear that the globe Earth theory became a runaway train which eventually was forced into the curriculum of the youngest possible students as a proven fact, and then never revisited again as an objective study in reality. Instead, we are forced to agree with the wild assumption that the world is a sphere in space without any room for deviation from this theory. As a result, we have an entire world full of people who are utterly deceived about the very world itself, to the degree that they are incapable of seeing reality, yet are programmed to defend the absurd deception, free of the burden of skeptically analyzing the globe Earth theory itself. So when we see things like 5G boxes being installed every couple hundred feet, or thousands of miles of cables being run along the seafloor to all continents, forming a physical network infrastructure, it should really bring into question the purpose, function, and necessity of satellites. We're led to believe that satellites are necessary to achieve wireless communications worldwide, yet upon inspection such things wouldn't even be possible, assuming for argument's sake that the Earth is a globe. For example, the highest alleged satellite is about 1 million miles in altitude, according to Alliance. This is the Solar and Heliospheric Observatory, or SOHO, a NASA and European Space Agency satellite. They claim that the SOHO is in a halo orbit around the Sun-Earth L1 point. That is the point between the Earth and the Sun where the balance of the larger Sun's gravity and the smaller Earth's gravity, quotes, is equal to the centripetal force needed for an object to have the same orbital period in its orbit around the Sun as the Earth. So the Earth and Sun are supposedly playing like a tug of war, with the rope being, of course, a vacuum, or a lack of things, lack of stuff, and the satellite is orbiting a point in the center of this tug of war where their influence is about equal. For one thing, radio frequency waves simply cannot propagate over 1,000,000 miles. That is patently absurd for Alliance to even make such claims, but of course, who is ever going to test or verify such claims? It isn't possible for anyone in the world to try a 1,000,000-mile distant radio shot. Such a thing is not possible to test, therefore the claims made by SOHO satellite lie in the realm of pseudoscience from a practical standpoint alone. Furthermore, we're expected to believe that the gravity of the Sun is going to affect something the size of a satellite, smaller than a minibus, from over 90 million miles away. We see other examples of impossible satellite trajectories in nature, in the form of those periodic cosmic interlopers such as Halley's Comet. I'll put a card to a video I did covering this topic in greater detail. But in short, Halley's Comet comes around every 75 or 76 years like clockwork, yet it's claimed to reach the distance, practically, of the so-called planet Pluto during Halley's furthest point from the Sun. So how is it possible for the Sun's gravity to create a situation where a relatively microscopic object can travel the distance approaching that of Pluto? Then the Sun's gravity causes that object to slowly reverse its trajectory and begin to make its way back towards the Sun, some 30 years later. But instead of crashing directly into the Sun, as you might expect logically, the comet instead nearly misses the Sun every single time, and is then jettisoned off into space for another 75 years. It's claimed that gravity is caused by mass and proximity between two objects. In the case of Pluto, it would be millions of times larger in theory, and of a higher density compared to the tiny, low-density comet, at least adhering to the globe Earth theory values of these two objects. You would expect to see the comet escape the grasp of the Sun's gravity once it reaches practically the distance of Pluto, for sure, as the mass simply isn't there to reciprocate a gravitic relationship with the Sun at that distance. But somehow the Sun's gravity allegedly pulls the tiny little microscopic low-density comet back into line for another flirtatious rendezvous decades later. At the end of the day, you simply cannot demonstrate objects being attracted to one another due to their mass alone. Sure, we can demonstrate magnetic properties causing independent objects to either attract or repel one another without any physical contact, but it's certainly not possible to demonstrate even very highly massive, high-density objects attracting one another due to mass alone. So gravity itself as a theory is not supported by any sort of factual evidence or experimental evidence whatsoever, yet we're expected to base our entire worldview around this concept of gravity. And then even handing physics gravity for argument's sake, you look at things like Halley's Comet, and it doesn't make any sense as to how the Sun's gravity could affect an object as small and low density as Halley's Comet once it reaches the distance approaching that of Pluto, according to the heliocentric theory. So, in conclusion, The idea of satellites as a necessary part of our modern Wi-Fi culture is laughable. Otherwise, we wouldn't need cell phone towers all over the place, or 5G boxes every couple hundred feet as they're rolling this out. Why wouldn't they just use satellites to achieve these ends? The answer becomes clear when you realize there is no such thing as a satellite, and so the thousands of miles of fiber optic cables running under the oceans, or thousands upon thousands of cell phone towers all over the place, are necessary to support the modern communications infrastructure, and has nothing whatsoever to do with satellites in the slightest. So with that, I'm going to wrap up this video. Hope you guys enjoyed. Once again, if you'd like to support this channel and become a patron with a recurring monthly contribution, little as $1, you can go to www.patreon.com/themorgile. And if you'd like to make a one-time contribution to the channel, your support is greatly needed and goes a long way to help. You can do so at www.paypal.me/themorgile. So with that, thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. God bless you guys. Love y'all. And as always, spread the word, spread the world, and peace.
You